They turn a blind eye, they choose not to see it, or they soft pedal it, or even perhaps even defend it. You hear all the usual BS like all relationships are hard, or maybe they didn't mean it that way, or he had a tough start in life. Just be nice to him. Maybe they're just stressed. It's work. You know the drill. You've heard all of it. If you have had any form of narcissistic relationship, you know about self-blame. You blame yourself for choosing this person. You blame yourself for not setting boundaries. You blame yourself for not trying harder. You blame yourself for saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. You blame yourself for not understanding narcissism. So let's just start there. If you'd like to drop a comment, what have you blamed yourself for? And sadly, because so many people don't get it, the enablers often toss fuel on that fire and say, oh, everyone messes up sometimes. Just give them another chance. Or they say things, oh, relationships are hard. Or they'll say stuff about glass houses and throwing the first stone, all that kind of stuff, so that you don't actually look at this relationship with your eyes wide open. People even do this when it is a family member, a person that they didn't choose. They may think, maybe I wasn't enough, or maybe I'm the one who's being difficult. After all, family is family. Or maybe I needed to make more allowances for their difficult backstory or all the sacrifices they told me they made. And again, blame themselves for not being able to keep taking the psychological punches that are such a part of these relationships. Now, people in the workplace who are having to deal with toxic and narcissistic bosses and workplaces blame themselves too. I'm the one who took this job. I could have done my homework better. Maybe I'm being weak-minded. This is a tough industry. I need to toughen up if I'm going to get ahead. But I recently heard a doozy. Okay, this was a blame on a new level. It was a conversation about between two people. One person was talking about how difficult their year had been. They had had a bit of a trifecta in the past year. A toxic workplace thing, a toxic family thing, and a toxic partner thing. This person was getting narcissistically abused from so many sides that they couldn't turn around fast enough to deflect from the next emotional punch. There were no places of respite or retreat or safety for this person. For them, work was hard, home was hard, and there were all kinds of triangulated messes happening with a parent and a toxic sibling. The person had been talking about the things going on in their life and how difficult it was with another person. The person going through all the difficult stuff was being really vulnerable, sharing all of this, and they were talking about how depleted they felt, how exhausted, and that they just needed a break. And then the other person that they were talking to said to them, I want to share my truth with you. And the truth sharer said, I think you have darkness in you and that you're attracting this and that you have to get rid of that darkness and that all of this toxic stuff would clear. And I was like, what the actual F? No. This was a whole new realm of blaming the survivor of not just one, but many narcissistic relationships. The darkness inside you attracted this? Oof, I was bummed out because it really pushed me to the point of a meltdown because I was incensed about this. It wasn't okay to see this happen. Now, please drop a comment. What is the most ridiculous way a narcissistic enabler has ever turned the blame back on you? Maybe that's not the most doozy one of all. I'm sure some of you have got some much doozier ones. Now, sadly, There is a big world of people out there who buy into manifestations and attractions and all of that. And that's fine. That's fine. If that gives somebody solace and they want to manifest and attract, then that's their groove. I respect that. If it works for them, then great. Okay? That's what people do to get through their days. Great. But to suggest that as part of feedback to a person who's going through so much narcissistic abuse, may I say no, no, and hell no. To have a person, and this person was literally surviving hourly gaslighting, invalidation, devaluation, manipulation, and they were trying to make some really difficult decisions in the midst of this. Do I stay in the marriage? Do I quit the job? Well, if I quit the job, it'll make it hard to leave the marriage. Do I skip Thanksgiving? They were asking themselves all kinds of questions, even about their family. Do I trust the narcissistic family members to ensure that the other family member gets the right medical care? This person who was grappling with all these different kinds of narcissistic abuse had been shouldering these burdens and heavy decisions kind of in a solitary way for quite some time, and was just trying to empathically manage lots of people and issues, and I guess in a weak moment, sadly, had turned to someone to just share, since they rarely got the time to do that, and they took that risk of being vulnerable. The darkness inside of you, what is that? The person who had this said to them, the person going through all this narcissistic abuse and had this said to them, had said that she felt her throat dry up and almost clench up when the other person said this. And then she sort of felt a lump in her throat, a heavy feeling in her gut, and a sense like the air had just been sucked out of her lungs. She basically said that she was having kind of every physiological sympathetic nervous system response at the same time, other than flight. But she just ended up nodding politely, not wanting to make a fuss, switched the conversation back to the darkness manifester person she was talking to and their life, and then tried to rush through the meal to get the check. The person who experienced this was still so empathic that she didn't want to tell this fool of a friend to just go to hell and how dare you, but rather knew that given the mess that her life currently was, that she would not need to see this friend for a very long time, and didn't want to get into an argument or deal with more gaslighting or more invalidation. It felt like too much of a risk. She also didn't even want to hurt this friend because the friend was not trying to hurt this person. They really believed what they were saying. But all of this is what we see with experiencers of narcissistic abuse. They still don't lash out at other people. They remain compassionate and empathic, even with the damned enablers out there. Now, I was kind of horrified when I heard this entire tale, but I acknowledge that it is more common than we think. We definitely very much live in a world where people don't want to believe that there are toxic people, even while it's always around us, it seems. That they don't want to believe that narcissism is a thing. They don't want that hope punctured. They don't want to believe that there are unchangingly unempathic people, I should say, who don't give a damn. They don't want to believe that people won't or can't change. They don't want to believe that life isn't fair. They don't want to believe that there are a lot of toxic folks out there, and we just need to learn to disengage from them and walk away. It's like a culty world of Pollyannas living in some kind of haze. And if they want to live in their haze, then by all means, you do you. But do not invalidate the real difficulties that people are having in these narcissistic relationships. To make it about the survivor of all of this abuse attracting their abuse was a bit of a new low. And needless to say, that person with the silly insights about attracting darkness had no useful ideas about how this person was supposed to fill themselves with the light, which is what I'm assuming is the antidote to the darkness. But that's the issue, isn't it? We want to house the blame for narcissistic abuse into the survivors, into the people experiencing it. Because by doing that, everyone else can walk around and say, oh, narcissism, schmarcissism. This person who is being narcissistically abused, they just have darkness in them. Or they just don't know how to say no. Or they're just blaming someone else. Or they don't know how to be forgiving. For some reason, everyone wants to pathologize the survivors. They'll even say things like, she just has PTSD or anxiety or OCD or depression or is too sensitive or is socially awkward or doesn't know how to speak up. Anything for some reason to let the damn narcissist off the hook. No, because none of that is true. I have seen the most strong, self-confident, successful people be broken by narcissistic abuse. I have seen people who have survived some pretty brutal traumas in their life be broken by narcissistic abuse. I have witnessed it happen to people of all genders, races, ages, cultures, religions, on and on. I have seen it happen to people who have all the money in the world and people who are flat busted broke. Narcissistic abuse, interestingly, has a rather universal impact on people. Money doesn't protect you. Religion doesn't protect you. The light inside of you doesn't protect you. I will tell you this, the one thing that can protect you, though, is knowledge. And folks, learning and sharing this knowledge is my job. I do this 12 to 14 hours a day, and I still get played. But the knowledge at least lets you see the red flags, and knowledge coupled with things like therapy or support that helps you quickly recognize that your cognitive dissonance is acting up and the trauma-bonded justifications are about to begin. That can help you catch yourself before you get sucked in too deeply. But this doesn't have one damn thing to do with darkness. Nobody wants to attract this. Nobody. Not consciously, not unconsciously. Our benefit of the doubt, second chance, forgiveness-obsessed world doesn't give people the permission, the time, the space, and the support that they need to set boundaries, to say no, to walk away, and to disengage. This isn't about your darkness. In fact, if anything, I do believe all of us do have light inside of us. But being around enough toxic people and being around enough narcissistic people has dimmed or extinguished that light in far too many people. The woman in that conversation got her stupid idea out of order. That woman going through the narcissistic abuse, her darkness did not attract the narcissistic people. The narcissistic people are what left her dark. If anyone ever muses to you about how maybe you attracted this narcissistic relationship, you have my permission to politely get up and walk away. No yelling, no cursing, no fighting, just grace. But in your head, you could be cursing like a sailor. Have you ever had a situation where you didn't take the bait, or you set a boundary, or you stopped giving the benefit of the doubt, or you stay calm when they are screaming and baiting, and then when someone else, a third party, asks you about how to connect with the person who is doing all of this, you say, there's no point in trying. This other person is toxic, they're narcissistic, they won't change, and you know what? I'm no longer going to engage with them. Have you ever done that? Well, then the other person, this third party, who's watching all of this play out, calls you out as being the difficult person, telling you that you are not being very charitable, that you are passive aggressive for not responding, saying that you are being unkind and implying that you are the one who's being holier than thou, as though, oh, I guess you've never done anything bad and now you're not talking to them and that now you're all high and mighty. Have you ever had that experience? After all the abuse you may have endured in a narcissistic relationship, once you finally get it, stop engaging with it, stop making excuses for it, and even are willing to call it what it is to other people, or just letting them know you're not going to fall for this again. To then have you be viewed as the problem, as the rotten one, or the intolerant one, or the self-righteous one, it really can feel like a bitter pill to swallow. So let's break this down a little bit, because it's a dynamic that's been happening to many people I'm watching and working with. How do you learn to tolerate being the bad one once you actually understand narcissism and set the boundaries and disengage? Because in a world in which most people are either narcissistic, are enablers, or just don't get it, they are very quick to call out the people who are smart enough to disengage, very quick to call out those people who disengage, the bad people. It really feels awful. You go through the arduous process of healing from narcissistic abuse. You go to therapy. You watch endless numbers of videos. You read some books. Maybe you started by talking to therapists who didn't get it. You talked to friends who didn't get it. You kept getting gaslighted. And one day, you hit the damned wall. And you say, enough. Enough. I refuse to engage with this narcissistic nonsense anymore. But once you get through to the other side, once you decide to stop engaging, once you stop falling for the gaslighting, once you set solid boundaries, once you stop taking the bait, you stop with the justifying and the excuse making, and you refuse to play the game anymore. Once you protect and preserve yourself, I'm going to tell you right out the gate, to do this is courageous and brave and strong and really, really difficult. And the grief and the rumination will continue to plague you even after you feel like you get it and you set the boundaries and you do it right. But then to do all that work and to have people call you out as, well, that's not very nice of you, or aren't you being a bit rigid about this, or people do deserve second chances, or you're called out as being uppity when you remain calm as the narcissist is baiting you, when the enablers and the folks who don't get it come out of the woodwork to call you out, it feels absolutely terrible. So how do you tolerate it? Remember what I have always said. Lots of people still aren't comfortable with the idea of how narcissism works, the idea that it doesn't change, of the harm that it does. And lots of people really aren't comfortable with the idea that boundaries and disengagement are the only healthy way forward. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's our feel-good or toxic positivity culture that just wants to believe that we can be positive and optimistic and everything will just turn out right. I wish I lived in that world, because when it comes to this stuff, that simplistic way of thinking does not work. And it keeps people trapped in toxic situations. But the folks who want to keep the status quo, who want to maintain the status quo, those are the enablers, the narcissists themselves, and the naive folks who still believe that everyone can just get along. The narcissistic folks who are amongst us remind me of when we were all children, and there was always that one awful kid who was mean and nasty and would do troublesome things. But they had such a knack for looking like the angel when the teacher or the adults came out that they would be smiling sweetly, and one of the other kids who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe trying to clean up the mess of the bad kid, was the one who would get called out for doing the bad thing that the manipulative little kid did, and the manipulative little kid would never come clean. The adult version of this happens all the time. Because here's what I really think is happening with adults. When you stay calm, when someone else is screaming at you or electronically stalking you, and you disengage and you don't try to waste your time trying to reassure them, you make the narcissist someone else's problem. Back in the day when you did engage with them, you were the lightning rod. You were the one who had to clean up the messes. You were the one who engaged with them. And you were the one who had the fights with them. And that meant other people didn't have to. But once you disengage, the narcissistic person is like a shark. They just keep going until they find something else to eat. And they will start screaming and demanding and bothering other people. So it's easier to pathologize you for staying calm and disengaging, because now the narcissist is going to move on from you than actually taking on the unfixable problem of the narcissist. It's like a game of hot potato. Nobody really wants to deal with them, so they'll try to shame you so you keep dealing with them. Don't do it. In addition, once people understand what narcissism really is, ideally, they start distancing not just from the narcissistic person, but from all of the unhealthy people that they now recognize are in their lives. And that means that all those people are losing control and power over you. Well, as a collective, all of these toxic people don't like it. I'm not saying they talk to each other, but they don't like it. So if some of them do know each other, it's easier to shade you and talk smack about you than to look inward and wonder if it's them. That's never going to happen. It's easier to write you off as arrogant or full of yourself or passive-aggressive or mean than to wonder, maybe our behavior was really far less than optimal. So what do? How do you tolerate being labeled the rotten, awful person for not giving the narcissistic person what they want? So let me break this down for you, because number one, if you've set boundaries, if that's what you've done, you aren't a bad person. You're just basically a grown-up truth teller. And people hate that this narcissism thing is a thing. I can't tell you how much criticism I get about it. Your behavior reminds them that they cannot stick their heads in the sand anymore. And your truth-telling may mean that the narcissist may start to target them instead, since you are no longer taking their abuse. And again, it's a game of hot potato. Number two, you are being gaslighted. Remember how this gaslighting dance goes. You're living your life, you're calm, you're minding your own business. The gaslighter is gaslighting you and denies your reality. You start defending and explaining and trying to make your reality known. You might even speak a little loudly. Then the gaslighter calmly says, "You need to calm down. You are acting crazy and this is too much drama." And yet, what sets you off, the reason you got a little agitated, is because you were being accused of something that was simply not true. So once you figure out this dynamic, that it's your escalation in the face of the gaslighting, and then you're like, I'm just going to stay calm, and you no longer become reactive, then the narcissistic person gets agitated. And believe it or not, you will be judged not just by the narcissist, but by other people for staying so calm in the face of their reactivity. More often than not, you'll be labeled as passive-aggressive. Once again, now you're being gaslighted. You can't win. Always remember that. You can't win with either the narcissistic people or their enablers. Number three, stop trying to school other people on narcissism. People either get it or they don't. When I try to explain this to people who are still drinking the proverbial Kool-Aid, they label me as a mean person, or as a bad psychologist, or as anti-establishment, or as a crazed feminist, or something like that. At this point, we've heard it all. Bottom line, as an example, I knew that the only way my kids were going to learn math was by doing their own homework. I couldn't do it for them. It's the same thing. It's not my job to convince anyone. I put the information out there. People can do what they want with it. I am not a missionary. If people don't want to get it, I know that experience will end up being their best teacher, and when this happens to them, then I suppose maybe they'll get it. And the same goes for you. Do not try to school the unschooled. Your power lies in you simply, you yourself, getting it. It's frustrating to watch someone not get it and keep getting played, or worse yet, listening to them criticize you. But it beats the hell out of wasting the time and effort trying to teach them something that they are not ready to learn. Number 4, stick to your guns. Don't budge. After going through narcissistic abuse, it is easy to keep doubting yourself and falling for it when people tell you that you aren't being nice since you are disengaging from difficult narcissistic folks, or that because you're not putting up with their BS. If you can figure out how to disengage from the narcissistic people in the world, quite frankly, you have a superpower. It's really that simple. The world at this present time in history is in the mess it is in because everyone keeps enabling the narcissistic folks and giving them second chances. You don't need to be a part of the problem. Other people calling you a bad person for actually not engaging with the narcissist allows them to stay in denial. They can stay in denial. You don't need to engage with them. Listen, none of us like being called the bad person, right? After years of feeling like a doormat or a repository of abuse or a punching bag, it sucks to transition to being the rotten person after going through so much. But it all comes down to the messenger, doesn't it? The people who call you out for setting boundaries and for not taking the bait just want to maintain the status quo and their convenient little lives. It becomes a wake-up call to you to clean house and set even more boundaries. I recognize that this can often be a lot of grief over so many losses, but these weren't healthy people for you. Self-preservation is a right. Always remember that. If that makes you a bad person, then I will happily call myself the baddest of the bad. You living authentically and in your truth scares the hell out of other people, especially when it comes to narcissism. Part of the healing from narcissistic abuse is being okay with other people not being okay. There is no version of this story where everyone gets what they want. What I want is I just want you healthy. As far as I'm concerned, the narcissistic people can go out and find new supply, as long as it's not you. But let's talk a little bit about discernment, and more specifically, because it's such an important tool, let's talk about people being shamed for being discerning. The most central tool to protecting yourself from a narcissistic relationship, and yet you're shamed for it. Let's break that down. So, things that survivors will sometimes say to themselves, especially after they've been through it and learned a little bit about narcissism. They may say, I'm being too fussy, or it's not realistic for me to expect so much of other people, or if I keep being this choosy, I'm going to end up alone. Discernment is one of the key tools in managing narcissism in your life. If done correctly, it can be a brilliant tool to keep them at bay, not let them in too far, set boundaries, and cut your losses early. It's a tough tool, especially if you are empathic, because for reasons of things like cognitive dissonance, socialization, a history of trauma bonding, and invalidating relationships, the tendency is to make excuses when you meet a narcissistic person early on, and even, honestly, after you know them for a while. But it's not that simple. What's even worse is that other people may shame you for being discerning. They may tell you that you're being too fussy, that you can't expect so much of people, or that if you keep doing this, you're going to end up being alone. Or they will even get in a dig like, oh, so you're so perfect, huh? So in essence, you get shamed for noticing red flags and wanting to disconnect, set boundaries, or distance. Now, I find that discernment, something I preach, is great in theory, but it can get quite thorny in practice. I myself have had lots of problems with it. I'll meet someone, they'll seem toxic, I'll distance. And then people have said to me everything from, Ramani, you're not a team player, to you have to give people a chance, to even when I don't say one thing, all I do is distance. Oh, Ramani, you think everyone's a narcissist, don't you? Yes, and they say it in that voice. Now that narcissism survival is a primary focus of my work, I've stopped caring what people say and think. But back in the day when those voices mattered to me, I would think to myself, sometimes on a bad day I still do, I'm a horrible person. I'm a witch. Maybe I'm the narcissist for taking this stand of discernment. And this negative messaging was mirrored by the numerous trauma-bonded relationships that I've had. But if you are going to be discerning, sadly, in some ways you've got to sort of tolerate the shaming, which means developing some pretty thick psychological calluses. So when people tell you that you're being fussy or that you're going to die alone, then you have to do some second-level discernment and ask yourself if the people issuing you those criticisms, if they're enablers, and you got to erect some boundaries around them too. There are some tricks to discernment, though. It's really hard to cancel the script inside your head that you are the one being difficult by being discerning. That's the work of slowly addressing trauma-bonded patterns, not confusing empathy with enduring abuse. That's not easy work. Now, when it comes to other people, one place to start is to not tell other people that you're doing this kind of discernment initially. Just bow out, distance, set a boundary, perhaps acknowledge that you're busy or don't have the time. Because when you share red flag detection and discernment with other people, they can be judgy. I think the idea of discernment may make people nervous because they are concerned that they could be flagged as a sort of a red flag person. And my advice to anyone, and the simplest advice, is literally the simplest advice in the world, is don't be an asshole. Like if everyone remembered that, a hell of a world. Also, what can be helpful is to look back at some situations when you were discerning, but still were able to know how that person was behaving in various situations. So then you could see that those red flags you detected early, those things that left you feeling uncomfortable, were a thing. In one of my more recent experiences of this in my life, it became apparent that someone I had met very, very quickly was toxic inside of 3 minutes of meeting him. He was absolutely awful. And I was viewed as a not nice person for avoiding him. I never even said anything about him. I just avoided him. I wouldn't work in small groups with him. I wouldn't even want to be seated next to him at dinner. His behavior was always awful. But everyone kept saying that no matter how different we are, we can all work together, kumbaya nonsense. It became a battle of tolerating the idea that I was being viewed as a difficult person, but this person really was. Then that toxic person, after a few years, emboldened by everyone cutting him a wide berth, did a really bad thing. It caused all kinds of problems. It wasn't even that it felt good that I was right, maybe a little bit. But the issue did hurt people, but it really taught me how difficult discernment is. I just had to be resolute and tolerate being unpopular. Whether we do discernment quietly and then shame ourselves, I'm fussy, I'm being uppity, or others shame us, who do you think you are, glass houses, all of that. The best tool, discernment, is one of the most difficult to use. But that doesn't mean you can't use it. Use discernment quietly. Again, reflect on that tiger's cage metaphor I've shared. If you have to test the waters by walking into the cage, you may get shredded up a bit, but then at least you tested the hypothesis And it kind of confirms that you were right in your instincts. Discernment doesn't mean that you have to turn on your heel and walk away. It doesn't mean that you have to share with others that you think this new person is toxic. It means trusting yourself for a minute, moving slowly, taking a minute, setting boundaries, and not waiting for other people to sign off on your decision. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse, so many survivors, have been gaslighted for so long and infused with a false narrative about themselves. You're the one who is the problem, right? That when people tell you that you're the one with the problem, you start to tend to believe them. If we wait for everyone to sign off on our choices around disengaging a little, setting boundaries, stepping away, then I have to tell you, none of us are ever going to get out of these relationships. You're never going to get full consensus. If you are more discerning, I can promise you, you're probably not going to be popular, but you'll definitely be happier. I'm asking you to do one thing. The one question I want you to stop asking. None of us should be asking this. It's a question that so many people ask survivors of narcissistic relationships. You ready for that question you're never supposed to ask? Why did you stay so long? Oh, don't ask people that. If any of you watching this have survived a narcissistic relationship, and usually this question comes up when people stayed in intimate relationships, this question almost inevitably comes up. And if you didn't get people asking you this one, then maybe you'd have gotten the equally bad question of, well, it wasn't that bad, was it? Now, people in the domestic violence world have grappled with people asking questions like this of survivors for years. And the reframe they offer, which is very wise, is, why do we keep asking the survivors why they stay? And instead, we should be asking the abusers why they abuse. But yet, when we ask this question, why did you stay so long? In a basic way, we're kind of blaming the survivor for this relationship. If they saw the red flags, they should have left, right? So if they didn't leave, then there must be something wrong with them. Or, God forbid, people think maybe they wanted the abuse. It's enraging to me when this is said, and it's absolutely ridiculous. One of the hardest things for survivors of narcissistically abusive relationships is how many people around them enable this unhealthy relationship. They turn a blind eye, they choose not to see it, or they soft pedal it, or perhaps even defend it. You hear all the usual BS like, all relationships are hard, or maybe they didn't mean it that way, or, oh, he had a tough start in life. Just be nice to him. Maybe they're just stressed. It's work. You know the drill. You've heard all of this. Now, the interesting thing is that the wake-up call sometimes happens when other people end up on the receiving end of that narcissistic person's toxicity. I actually really am offended when a person is a raging narcissist out there and other people will say, well, they were perfectly nice to me. What the hell does that even mean? Someone else is suffering at the hands of the voice of this terrible person. So maybe we do need to take a more critical look at this person and their behavior. But it's like a mosquito. We're all going to get bit. Sit outside long enough on a summer night and you're going to get stung. The same thing applies for narcissistic people. At some point, if you hang out with one long enough, you will experience their sting. So then, after people around you may see the narcissist's rage or bad behavior, they may be more likely to say, yikes, that was a really rotten person. Why did you stay so long? Now, sometimes when people ask this question, why did you stay so long? It's not ill-intentioned. It's merely someone sometimes trying to understand something. Maybe they genuinely want to know what the competing issues were. Did you stay for reasons of children or money or religion? However, first of all, it's none of their damn business. But it's never a good question because it puts the survivor on the spot. And it is also shaming. The undercurrent of this question is often, why didn't you leave sooner? What are you, dumb? Were you a codependent? Did you just not see it? That kind of questioning can activate the shame that most survivors experience throughout the relationship and leave them feeling even more foolish and more self-blaming. There is nothing good that comes out of this question of why did you stay so long? So you may be wondering, I'm close to someone who is going through narcissistic abuse or a really difficult relationship. What should I ask someone instead? What do I ask someone who is leaving a difficult relationship? Maybe you ask or you say, do you want to talk about it? Are you okay? How are you feeling? Questions that show concern and empathy, not all the blamey, shamey stuff. If you get deeper in the conversation, then it might even be better to ask things like, it sounds like it was so difficult and so confusing. I can understand why you felt so stuck. Empathy is the one gift in the world that fits every time. We already know why people stay. Fear, confusion, guilt, lack of information, lack of knowledge, children, money, religion, culture, hope, resignation. It's understandable. I know people who were given bad guidance and they were told to work on communication in their relationship, and they got stuck in one of these relationships for another 10 years. Even when people are taught about radical acceptance and realistic expectations and how narcissism works and why it doesn't change, some people still stay. But they may stay with their eyes wider open and their minds more wise. Asking someone, why did you stay so long, is intrusive. And if you are a survivor, you may be wondering, what can you do under these circumstances if you are hit with this question? I always tell my clients, you don't owe anyone a damned answer to this question. Many survivors out there are incredibly nice, empathic people, and they don't want to be rude. They may respond with things like, it's a long, complex story, and that's too simple a question. Or simply, they could answer, it's just more than I want to get into right now. Those who knew you will know why, and they will support you. Those who don't get it will never get it. Narcissistic abuse appears to be one of those things you don't really get until you actually go through it. People feel entitled to breakup stories, to hear about people's breakups. Who knows, maybe it makes them feel better about their own lives. Maybe it's genuine curiosity, gossipy curiosity, or your life being sort of their movie of the week to watch. Maybe it is just that simple desire for gossip. But when it comes to narcissistic abuse, most people don't understand it. Many people judge it. And survivors have already been through enough without having to regurgitate their stories for potentially judgmental audiences. None of us are entitled to look behind the curtains of anyone's soul. Just don't ask anyone this question. And if you're ever the one who's on the receiving side of it, don't feel that you owe anyone an explanation. So there you go. I rarely get to say never in life. Never ask anyone, why did you stay so long? At some point, if you give them time, space, and safety, you'll probably start to understand it. And also, never gaslight someone telling you about this. If they're telling you, then please listen to them. Don't question them, and never, never say, it really couldn't have been that bad. Trust you me, I've heard thousands of these stories at this point. Yes, it really was that bad. So when we lay out the patterns that are observed in people who are experiencing narcissistic abuse, confusion, self-doubt, anxiety, apathy, helplessness, hopelessness, powerlessness, rumination, anger, sadness, all kinds of physical symptoms, it's not actually surprising that survivors are often diagnosed with, treated for, and believed to be experiencing a whole range of psychiatric issues, including anxiety disorders, mood disorders, adjustment disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, and even personality disorders. Now, in some cases, in more than a few cases, these assessments are true of the individuals, experiencing these symptoms and who also have to be going through narcissistic abuse. But here's the rub. It's not always true. And in the absence of a thorough analysis of the precipitants or the things that set off the symptoms in a person's life, especially a precipitant or a trigger like a toxic relationship, we may be spending too much time pathologizing the survivor and not the situation. And in many cases, both things are happening. A person may be experiencing an anxiety disorder, but may be experiencing more pronounced symptoms because of the narcissistic abuse. In the macro, in the bigger worldview, there's a risk to focusing solely on the survivor's current patterns and behaviors. It's something, though, that often happens in mental health. You work with the patient in the room. That's all you got. You have the person in front of you. You hear them talk about their symptoms and patterns. You throw them into the hopper, and often out pops a nice DSM diagnosis. But in the toxic relational realm, like narcissistic relationships, it's not quite that simple. Because when we focus all of the attention on diagnosing the survivor, we are perpetuating a cycle that the survivor is already stuck in. And that cycle is self-blame, self-pathologization, a playing out of gaslighting narratives by other people. What's wrong with you? There must be something wrong with you. You must be crazy. Your anxiety is making you forget things. These are the scripts that are playing through someone's head who survived these relationships. The survivors are more likely to come into therapy than the narcissists or other antagonistic people who tend to have very little self-reflective capacity and are unable to engage in the work of therapy. Thus, the survivors of narcissistic abuse often bear the burden of being diagnosed much more often than those who are actually generating the harm, because those folks rarely go into therapy. I have been told or heard countless stories of people being told that if they could just get their symptoms under control, so survivors could just get their symptoms under control, if they weren't so needy or didn't need so much reassurance or had a little more energy, then maybe their partner or whomever it is in their life that they're having a difficult narcissistic relationship with, the relationship would work a little better. One case in particular, I had been a long time ago told about. A therapist said, well, now that we have you diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, we can get you treated, and I'm sure your partner's going to notice the difference and things will get better. The woman, the patient, who had the so-called anxiety disorder, was in a horrifically difficult relationship with a malignant narcissistic person. And this woman walked on eggshells. Even in her sleep, she was afraid of making noise. And sadly, was so confused by the relationship that her diagnosis of an anxiety disorder meant that she had hope. She could put the blame on herself, and she had hope that once she had her anxiety in check, then things would get better. She did the hard work on her anxiety, took medications, went through therapy. Things didn't get better in the relationship. Why? Because her partner was a narcissist. And her symptoms actually continued to get worse because nothing was shifting in the relationship, no matter how much work she did. Another issue around focusing on the pathology of the survivor is the common error of making assumptions about the problematic communication skills of the survivor in a narcissistic relationship. Because after all, if they were communicating properly, then these things shouldn't be happening. Many, many, many survivors of narcissistic abuse have been harmed in couples therapy, family therapy, even in workplace mediation by people who do not understand these dynamics and will focus on the, if you will, communication errors of the person who experienced the antagonistic and narcissistic relationship rather than reflecting on the idea that perhaps the narcissistic person has never listened, never offered empathy, and probably never will. This is the reason that it is so important for all clinicians to understand the fallout of what happens to a person who is or has been in a narcissistic relationship. A central pillar of treatment for narcissistic abuse is psychoeducation. Yes, I know the familiar refrain and will make it here. I know this very clearly. We cannot diagnose someone that we have not met. This isn't about diagnosing or labeling the spouse or the partner or the parent or the friend or the sibling or the boss. This is about focusing on the patterns the client experienced. Calling out gaslighting as gaslighting, calling out invalidation as invalidation, contempt as contempt, verbal abuse as verbal abuse. And no, this is all not just a big misunderstanding or someone having a bad day or I'm sure they didn't mean it. It's about calling out the patterns and to understand that these patterns, especially when they're consistent, are reflective of a rigid and antagonistic personality style that does not change. To let the client know that when someone manipulates them, it is not about the client, it's about the manipulator. There is a real danger to focusing on pathologizing the survivor rather than seeing that the systems and the abusers are the issue. The systems and the narcissistic abusers are rarely under the microscope, so they may not be subjected to the same level of clinical scrutiny. But the survivors are desperate for help, so they go into therapy. Now, when we do that, when we pathologize the survivors, we re-perpetrate these cycles for generations and augment the trauma and the harm. The balancing act here is very tricky. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse or people who are experiencing the wide range of fallout of antagonistic relationships are struggling with lots of clinically significant symptomatology: anxiety, depression, apathy, post-traumatic stress symptoms, confusion, self-doubt, self-blame, helplessness, hopelessness. And these kinds of patterns do require clinical attention. However, more attention must be paid to the context in which these symptoms occur. That when a client shares patterns within a relationship, such as gaslighting and invalidation and future faking and all the rest of it, to pay attention. And yeah, we have to address the anxiety and the expectable behaviors and thoughts and feelings that would be observed in someone, in anyone who is caught in a toxic relationship. But also to help a person who's caught in these situations to understand the triggers, the activations, and before just putting a tidy diagnostic label, oh, you're so anxious on it, that implies that the person in the toxic relationship just dealing with the anxiety or sadness or hypervigilance and labeling that as a disorder, we absolutely have to ensure that they're educated about what is happening to them. It gives a very important context. When we understand post-traumatic stress disorder, we need to also understand the trauma. That model is also very similar in narcissistic abuse. We need to understand the relationship or the history of relationships that are narcissistic, and then help the client understand the relationship between their symptoms and the narcissistic abuse, while also monitoring all the other patterns they're going through. It's a lot, but it's a chicken-egg issue. To address the clinical patterns like the anxiety a person's going through without addressing the toxic relationship means that you're ignoring the larger context, and it's also unlikely the treatment will work. When we pathologize someone, we do to some degree diminish their power and in some ways silence their voice. People who are pathologized tend to come at things in a more tentative manner and are less trusting of their voice. This is a pattern, as I said, we have observed in domestic violence survivors for a very long time. But when people come in for help because they're being abused, they don't expect to be diagnosed themselves because that's what often happens. Whether the narcissistic abuse happens in the context of an intimate relationship, a familial relationship, or a workplace relationship. The knee-jerk reaction is to focus on the issues and the problems and the patterns of the person who's come in, and not the fact that the so-called issues that they've brought in are often normal reactions to an abnormal situation. It's missing the point to not identify that and continues to blame a survivor who has already been doing that, blaming themselves and pathologizing themselves for a very long time. Anyone who is seeing a mental health professional should not only have their current symptoms assessed, but also have a full mental health history taken, triggers explored, stressors examined, a look at relational issues, family history, medical history. They're all critical to assess in order to paint a larger picture. Too often in the world of mental health and in our zealousness and desire to figure it all out, or maybe even please an insurance company, we focus on diagnosing the individual rather than the context, and that's a mistake. So the key really becomes is that, yes, survivors are going through something, and the things that they're going through are really impairing their lives. That's absolutely the case. But when we attempt to put the full onus of it, try to understand what the client is going through and say, well, you have this disorder, rather than helping them understand the connection between their patterns and symptoms, and the narcissistic relationship and the gaslighting and contempt and all those things and the effect that has on them, what we do is we sort of foster the client's sort of lack of understanding of the situation, and then we impede our growth. It's important that we educate survivors and definitely identify clinically significant patterns that require best practices and evidence-based treatment. But it's also critical that we shouldn't get so lost in attempting to diagnose and pathologize the survivors before we explain to them the impact of these relationships. Thanks again.